Good day, grade 12s. The series of lessons that we are recording at this particular moment will focus on the drama Hamlet by William Shakespeare. Here's a brief biography of the author William Shakespeare. I am sure by now most of you have become familiar with the playwright William Shakespeare, and we use the word playwright to differentiate between somebody writing novels and somebody writing plays. So he was born in 1564. He is English by birth, and he died in approximately 1616. What we need to know about him is the fact that his father was a glove maker. He apparently married a woman named Anne Hathaway in 1582, and by all accounts it seems that he did not have an extended scholastic education. Apparently he only went as far as grammar school. However, what one must say is that he was an amazing writer who wrote interesting stories and really brought such a variety of characters to life. Many of the dramas written by William Shakespeare were not original in the sense that Shakespeare came up with his ideas and drafted those scripts from scratch. What we do know is that there were dramas that had already been in existence, and what Shakespeare did is that he basically re-looked at those, re-envisioned them, and then changed the characters and also the plot to his liking, obviously to suit the particular audience of his day. So Hamlet was written around about between 1599 and 1601. This literary period is called the Renaissance, and the Renaissance period was approximately, or spanned from the 1500s to 1660. And what the Renaissance was basically was an era of rebirth where many dynasties started discovering new territories. For example, you had what we call and I'm going to say this reservedly, discovery in inverted commas, of many European countries discovering other countries in your Americas and in the rest of Africa. And so too, with this era of discovery, there were also different thoughts that were doing their rounds, and so there was a lot more experimentation happening as far as literary works is concerned. And so Hamlet falls into the tradition of the revenge tragedy, in which the central character's quest for revenge usually results in general tragedy. The story is based on a Danish revenge story, and the setting is Kronborg Castle in Elsinore during the pre-Viking era, and this would be circa the 1st century. Now, in the original stories, a Danish prince fakes madness in order to take revenge on his uncle who had killed the prince's father and married his mother. And indeed, the drama Hamlet follows this particular plot. So why do people still teach Shakespeare? You know, I teach students, and the initial response is one of resistance until they discover that they do understand the story despite the language that is being used. And sometimes they find themselves understanding the characters much more depth than they had originally anticipated. So sometimes these stories resonate with you, and you also find yourself identifying with the experiences that the different characters have to go through. So how can you make Shakespeare easy for yourself? Firstly, familiarize yourself with the features of the plot. What is the plot? The plot is what the story is about, what happens at the beginning, the middle, and the end, and everywhere in between. Also, know the different characters, their names, their personalities, their vices and their virtues, and make sure you know how to spell their names. Think of them as people and think of yourself as a psychologist, where you have to analyze their actions, make comments about those actions, and in that way you get to know these characters, and perhaps you also predict how they would behave in certain circumstances. Use the resources that you have. And your first resource is your textbook, and which includes things like the actual text as well as commentaries and explanations. Now you read these commentaries and explanations in conjunction with the actual dialogue. I must be honest, I have studied Shakespeare for so many years, and I will never be able to understand Shakespeare fully by just reading the raw text. I often have to refer to the critical comments as well as the explanations and the glossary, which includes some of the terminology, in order for me to get a full understanding of the text itself. Now, these explanations fill important gaps that we might not understand, given that the text was written over 300 years ago. For example, you take a word like conceit. We understand conceit as referring to an aspect of our personality. For example, if you are conceited, then you are seen as being supercilious, or you are full of yourself, as you say. Now, a word like conceit in Shakespeare's time has a totally different meaning, and conceit there refers to one's thoughts. So as you can see, the play is quite dated, but the issues that we deal with and the way in which Shakespeare has shaped his characters is basically quite universal, and these issues are issues that we still deal with, or some of us still have to contend with in this day and age. I also want to add in conclusion that you actually need to be positive and ask yourself, okay, I have to complete this text, but let me see how much I can learn. In order for you to fully understand any text, you need to understand the context. So what does context refer to? Context refers to the historical era in which any text has been written. It could also refer to the geographical location, which serves as the setting for the drama or the novel or the short story for that matter. In this case, the drama has been set in Denmark. And let's look at the historical facts and the era as well as the schools of thought that might have influenced Shakespeare when he created those characters, because it will give us insight into the values and the principles that these characters feel are important. So Hamlet is seen as being a product of the Reformation. And now what is the Reformation? It's an era in which the Protestants broke away from the then dominant Catholic Church. So what we have there is then there is a different school of thought. There is a lot of skepticism, with people questioning certain aspects of the church and how things had been done traditionally. Then you also get the school of thought, which was very popular in Northern Europe, which suggested that there were certain limits to human knowledge and that human beings could only achieve so much. Remember, in the past, in certain schools of thought, in Greek mythology, human beings were seen as immensely capable and superior and even mystical beings. So this would explain why Hamlet has this constant anxiety. He's always questioning himself, because he lives in an era where questioning is considered an important part of the existence. You know, so there is the break from the old and moving on to the new, and often when that happens, there is a lot of suspicion, there's a lot of fear in society when that does happen. And so Hamlet is this individual who constantly thinks about everything. And so he thinks about issues that were important in the day. For example, you know, how do we judge people? You know, sometimes we judge people on appearances, or we judge things on the way they appear, but in reality, there's actually another picture that we need to also examine. He also questions the sinfulness of suicide. Things like the unfairness of killing a murderer while a murderer is praying and resulting in that murderer actually going to heaven, whereas that murderer should then ideally be sent to hell for the crimes committed on earth. Now, all of these issues that Hamlet is contemplating so deeply are as a result of this new school of thought and the changes in society that have erupted after the break from the church, as well as the new discoveries that have been made. The drama Hamlet is set in Europe, specifically in a small country called Denmark. So if you look at the map on the screen in front of you, you will see that Denmark is a small country in yellow. And then we have countries like Norway and Sweden, who are located close to Denmark. So during that time, there were many disputes regarding land issues. And in this case of Hamlet, there is, at the opening of the play, there is also a dispute involving land of old King Fortinbras of Norway, whose son is agitating to get the lands back which his father had lost 30 years previously in a fight with old King Hamlet. The play is indeed set in the castle. The castle is called Elsinore. And as you can see the picture of the castle, this is where your kings reside. And the castles also have a particular structure, architectural structure. Remember that they also had to defend themselves against onslaught from other lords and also other challenges to the monarchy. Often when people study Shakespeare, they talk about the great chain of being. Now, this is not really a literal chain. It is just an explanation of how people viewed the hierarchy or the levels of various inhabitants of the earth in relation to God. So, at the top of your chain of being, you will have God. So that is just a general understanding. And below God, there would be the angels, and then you would have the demons, then your stars, your moons, and then you would have your kings. So as you can see, the king was quite close to God, and there was an understanding that the king was placed on the throne by divine intervention, and that it was God himself who placed kings in that particular position of power. So the audiences believed in the great chain of being, and it was apparently this great chain of being that determined the natural order of events. So the understanding was that this is how the world was structured, and this is what God has ordained. If you see right at the bottom, you would have minerals, and then somewhere there you would have the nobles, and then you would have ordinary men, and these would be your serfs. Your serfs were what we call the lower classes, who did not have any land at that particular time. And just below the serfs, it's apparently you have the category of the wild animals. So you can see there was not very much respect for people who were not of the nobility. And so you can see this chain that people referred to in many ways dictated how people lived their lives. It would suggest that the ordinary man would not be able to become, for example, a prince, because God apparently had ordained the world to be structured in this fashion. So let's, for example, say the king is murdered. What would that mean? It meant that whatever God has placed on the earth and ordained has now been tampered with. And so with the king being killed and dying an unnatural death, it would then disrupt the chain of being. And thus, by implication, it would disrupt the laws of nature and the laws of God. And therefore, you would have a series of weird and bizarre events which would then occur as a result of this great chain of being tampered with. Just a last thought, remember, this is not a literal chain, but it is just basically a school of thought in which people of the time tried to make sense of the world in which they lived. Let's look at some of the issues or beliefs that the people in Hamlet and Shakespeare's time held. As mentioned earlier, It was believed that the king was appointed by God in order to assure the stability of society. And so removal of the king would disrupt the chain of being, and this would then create chaos and disorder and universal disaster. People were also quite superstitious, and they believed in ghosts and the existence, and as many of us believe, in the devil, but they also felt that the devil would make an appearance in some guise or other. So, for example, they could believe that the ghost of a murdered person would return to demand revenge from the murderer. They also believed that the ghost could appear on earth in many different guises or forms. How then was madness viewed in Shakespeare's time? At that stage, the study of psychology was not developed yet. And so a person who was insane or seen as insane was treated dismally. It was believed that this person was insane as a result of being punished for sins that they had committed. And sometimes when people were prone to having seizures, it was believed that they were possessed of evil spirits. And as a result, these people were often ostracized and terribly mocked and rejected by society. We've examined the chain of being and just the school of thought that existed at the time and how people saw the world that they lived in. We also looked at the moral climate of the time, in people's beliefs in ghosts and demons, etc. And now we're going to look at the conflicting beliefs that existed and which greatly affected the protagonist in the drama Hamlet. The Renaissance code of honor differed and clashed with the Christian ethics and beliefs of the time. In Christianity, seeking forgiveness is seen as being noble and honorable. You were expected to turn the other cheek when somebody harmed you. If you murdered somebody, it was seen as a mortal sin, even if it was a revenge attack. It is also felt that, the soul is eternal, and at some stage you have to account for your good deeds and your evil deeds, while political power is only temporary. So this is this great belief in the afterlife, and that on earth we're only here for a temporary visitation in which we have to prepare for the afterlife. Suicide is seen as a huge sin because it would seem as if it challenges the will of God. But in Hamlet's time, there was also a code of honor that existed. Now remember, these codes were not written down. It was just the expectation that people had of how individuals should behave. For example, revenge in Hamlet's time was seen as being aristocratic, noble, and honorable. And if Hamlet hesitated as he does, it could suggest that he was a coward, and that he would feel some sense of humiliation that he's not able to commit this act of vengeance. It is also believed at the time that suicide would redeem an individual's honor. And so if you committed a crime, for example, or if you brought your family or your name into disrepute, the honorable thing would be to commit suicide, and then the world would then see you once again as an honorable and dignified individual. And so you can see Hamlet is torn between the beliefs of the time as well as the religious beliefs which existed as well. So in a sense, he is almost in a catch-22 situation, and that is one of the reasons why Hamlet is so indecisive. Hamlet is a tragedy. Now, Shakespeare wrote quite a number of comedies as well as poetry, and then there are the tragedies. And all the tragedies have a similar structure and similar components. So let's look at the features or elements of a Shakespearean tragedy. It is a genre of writing, as mentioned, with its own traditions and criteria. Each tragedy has a tragic hero. So what is a tragic hero? A tragic hero is an individual who is born into nobility. He might be a prince, a king, or a member of nobility, as for example, Macbeth was a lord. He is endowed with a tragic flaw, and in this case, it is indecisiveness. Hamlet cannot make up his mind and then act. It has the potential to be an excellent leader because of his innate qualities, but he is doomed to fail because of that tragic flaw. The hero then makes some kind of tragic mistake, and as a result, this causes his fall from greatness. So it is somebody who has immense potential, but because of some act of weakness, their reputation is ruined, and they themselves are ruined and eventually die. So at some point, the hero realizes that he has made an irreversible mistake, and one can actually say that he is the cause of his own fate, his own ruin. He at some point faces and accepts his death with honor, and then meets a tragic death. Some of the Shakespearean tragic heroes die by their own hand, and others then die by the hand of the antagonist. It doesn't matter how they die. At the end, their reputations are redeemed in a sense, and we find that when the character meets his or her death, let me retract. It's not a play written in the modern era, so it is a character, it's basically male characters, and when he meets his death, he is then redeemed, and the audience then once again sees him in a positive light. That greatness that is promised, unfortunately, is no more, and so we kind of mourn the loss of this tragic figure who could have made such a great contribution to the society in which he lived. In order to understand the text fully, you need to also understand key concepts. So you need to familiarize yourself with these key concepts because they give you a greater understanding of your texts, your characters, as well as the themes. The first concept we are going to deal with is the protagonist. The protagonist is the leading character in a novel, a short story, or drama. He or she is the center of the story. They make key decisions, and they suffer the consequences of those key decisions that they have made. The antagonist, on the other hand, is the villain of the story, and he or she is the adversary of the hero or protagonist of the drama or other literary work. He poses a threat to the well-being and existing of the protagonist. So in other words, he, in this case, because it is written during the 17th century, is a male character, makes life very difficult for the protagonist, and as a result of the antagonist's actions, it does contribute to the death and decline of the protagonist. You also need to understand what a soliloquy is. A soliloquy is a word that is taken from Latin, and it simply means talking by oneself. It is a speech that a character makes, but it is not directed at anyone. Another character, for example, or the audience itself. It's a device that dramatists, especially Shakespeare, uses to allow the character to communicate his or her own thoughts directly to the audience without addressing them specifically. So a soliloquy then is essentially a speech in which the character conveys his or her thoughts and feelings to the audience without specifically addressing them. You know, if it were in a cartoon, it would probably be written in a speech bubble. So it's just a reflection of his or her thoughts and feelings at a particular moment. Another concept that we need to understand is the monologue. Now, the monologue is a speech made by one of the characters but it is a lengthy speech that is made to another character. Now, unlike the soliloquy, where other characters do not hear what the character says during his soliloquy, with the monologue, the other characters hear and they are part of the audience who listens to what the speaker says. So it is more like a long speech, and it is not actually a dialogue. Now, Shakespeare's play is full of monologues, and among the most famous is Mark Antony's "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ear" speech in Julius Caesar, where Mark Antony addresses the Roman crowd after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Remember that the monologue is a speech with an audience, whereas the soliloquy is a reflection of the character's thoughts and feelings at a particular moment, and the audience, or sorry, the other characters cannot hear what the character says. It is not intended for the other characters to hear, but basically just gives the audience insight into the character's psyche, mental makeup, or thoughts at that particular moment in the drama. Of course, what would a drama be without the element of, or an element of, dramatic irony? So what is dramatic irony? Simply put, it is when the audience knows something that is going to happen in the play, or knows something about other characters, but the characters in the play are not aware of this information. So here, the audience knows more than what the characters know. It is used to engage the audience into what is going to take place. So by having knowledge of something that is occurring, the audience is able to witness the character's area of action with which other characters are unaware of. And so this knowledge gives the audience foresight into what is going to happen to a particular character during the play, and this also induces the audience's tragic feelings of sorrow and grief. So in other words, it engages the audience and involves them in the emotions of the character, as well as predicting and also experiencing, a sense of helplessness when they realize what a character is going to go through, especially if the character is going to make a mistake, and what the consequences of that mistake is going to be. Now, in Hamlet, dramatic irony is used by the playwright to emphasize how mischief and dishonesty can actually lead to tragic consequences. One other important concept to understand is that of a foil. So what is a foil? A foil is basically the name given to a character or a number of characters in a drama who serve to emphasize similar or opposing traits in another character, which is usually the protagonist or the main character. So the playwright juxtaposes these characters with the main character to highlight similarities between the characters, but also to emphasize the differences in their personalities as well as in their actions. And so the playwright's intention is to juxtapose them so that you can compare the two and show the similarities, but more importantly, to highlight their differences. The foils in the play for Hamlet are Fortinbras, Laertes, Ophelia, who is a kind of female foil for Hamlet, and then there is Pyrrhus, a character in the play which Hamlet asks one of the actors to recite after he meets them. We have now come to the end of the lesson on the different concepts that you have to understand. So just a recap. Most importantly, make sure you understand those concepts. Make sure you understand the features of the play, namely the plot, the themes, and especially get to know the characters.